To break the ice, if you permit me, I did a translation of a Japanese poet whom I love very much a couple of years ago, and it was picked up again in Mexico, and the edition with my translation is a translation from the English. I don't know Japanese, so don't be too impressed, okay? Has 4 beautiful black and white drawings of Roman Topolsky, who's sitting here, and a beautiful cover by him. I will pass it around. Don't steal it. I want it back. For you to see the beauty of his work. So if you're interested, please take a look at that. And also, people say things, but in a rational and scientifically oriented world, all things that are said have to be proven. I've been bragging about the fact that I write a poem every day. Well, here's the proof that this morning I wrote a poem, so pass it around and you can see it. This I definitely won back, okay? And you can ask anything you wish. Please.
Michelle tells us you're writing poetry constantly. You write like you breathe. Have you written a poem about the Saint Vincent community or any of the settings here this week?
Well, I've written, since I'm here, I think I'm here 3 days now, so I've written 3 poems. I measure my life by poems, not by days. And the 3, of course, are signed Saint Vincent College, Pennsylvania. One of them, because I tend to forget them, but one of them I wrote in church while Mass was going on. And I think it captures the feeling of Mass, of the priests, the monks being there. I think that poem, I dare say, is in a peculiar way a highly religious poem. The one I wrote this morning, I give the same title to all the poems I'm writing here. The title is General Cleaning, which in my house in Havana was done on Thursdays by my mother and the maid and things like that. And it represented to me as a child turmoil. Everything was in order, cleaning is turmoil, and then going back to order. So the poetry that I'm doing now has to do with this concept, I think. And this morning I wrote a poem where the mother appears, and the narrator of the poem is, the word I use in Spanish is revestir, that is to say, when you're dressed, you get undressed and you are redressed in a different fashion. So there's a process of transformation, continuous transformation in the poem, wherein the mother becomes many things, many figures. She's a maiden afraid of a man who's eventually my father. She is a woman with fantasies that are hidden. She is the woman cleaning the house, the woman playing games with the son relating to the games of the mother, laughter between mother and son. So all these things that are coming together in the poem, somehow in a very imprecise but very real sense, have something to do with a religious spirit, with a surge. There's a wonderful phrase that was attributed to Proust, the French writer. He said, "I do not believe, but I have great faith." And I can subscribe to that faith, to that phrase. I'm not sure about belief, but I'm sure about faith. Now, my faith is faith in poetry, faith in the written language. And I'm not saying faith in what I do. I have tremendous uncertainties, as I think any human being ought to have and has. But I do have faith in something called poetry. And true poetry is as close to God or religiousness or, pardon?
A prayer?
Or a prayer, a form of devotion, as any other. In my mind, and perhaps this is not fair, it is as high as music. A great poet, Shakespeare, a great poet, Vallejo, is as marvelous as Bach or Handel, Whereas, in general, modern painting or in general, the novel don't reach those levels. For historical reasons. I mean, the potential is there, but they've moved in different directions, more crematistic, more oriented to mercantilism and money-making devices. We've remained purer, quite frankly, out of necessity. We're not read, we don't sell, so on and so forth. So, on one hand is painful or makes one's life difficult, but on the other hand, is wonderful because it gives you complete freedom. I don't sell. I have the freedom to say and express anything I want. There's nothing to curtail my voice. You know what I mean? Of course, I didn't answer your question.
I was just thinking. Are we going to hear or see this poem that you wrote on Monday, or when you were in Mass?
It's in that notebook that hasn't been corrected or cleaned or typed or anything. So I don't know. It's in Spanish. There's no English version. So what do you want from me? Maybe we can have Michelle translate it in 2 minutes. You know, she can.
Interpret it.
Yeah.
I'm curious to know, when I meet writers, I'm always curious to know what they read. What do you read? On a lazy Sunday afternoon, what book you pick off the shelf to sit down and read?
Okay. You know, I can answer that as follows. I began reading as a child. I began with Robinson Crusoe, and I said that in your class. My mother came to me one day when I was 10, and the pretension of the 3 wise kings was gone. I didn't believe in that anymore. I was precocious. And at that point, I got Robinson Crusoe, and my mother said, this Latin thing, which is, I think it's toma lege, here, read, you know, or I don't know exactly how it goes in Latin, but it means here, read. She imposed on me reading, and I took it very nicely. I took Robinson Crusoe, I started reading, I was very engaged immediately. I read from page 1 to the last page, finished, closed the book, went back to page 1 and reread the entire book. And ever since then, I haven't stopped reading. Something happened to me which is very curious. The minute I read that book, every night as I went to sleep, from age 10 to around 40, 41, 42 years of age, I could not fall asleep unless I imagined that I was Robinson Crusoe lost in an island. But this is true. This is a fact. I mean, it shows how neurotic and psychotic I am, but it is a fact, you know? And somehow in my 40s, the whole issue changed, and thank God I got rid of that monstrosity. But it was wonderful also being Robinson Crusoe lost in an island. Also what happened was, I mean, I'm Cuban-born. I lived in Cuba up to age 20. My first readings were Robinson Crusoe, a book about whales, which was not Moby Dick and Melville, a popular book. And I remember reading meant words, and words meant vocabulary. And the books I even brought from Cuba all contain underlinings and words that I didn't know the meaning, so I went patiently to the dictionary to look for the meaning, and I see X word with the meaning from the dictionary. So it seems that since early in my life, I needed to know words, needed to know the meaning of words, and having a huge vocabulary. People say to me, in Latin America especially, you know more words than the dictionary. And it is true. I've added a few words to the dictionary by now, you know. But it's been a form of voracity since I can recall. From there on, my struggle has been, you know, I've been a father, a husband, a citizen, this and that. So, you know, how do you read, write, and meet the challenge of daily life? So I've had the luck, the fortune to teach and have a lot of free time. Teaching is the best during the summers when you're free, as you know, and you still have your salary. So that I was always able to read. Part of the conflict was I live in the States and I need to read in Spanish. So how do you get to the Spanish books? Well, traveling meant buying books. My wife always complained that I wouldn't let her put an underpant in the luggage because I wanted to put another book. You know, when I bought another book and I wanted to put it in the luggage. But to me, it meant acquiring books in Spanish so that I could compensate reading English and Spanish. At one point, I retired, 97, so it's been 13 years I'm retired. And my life now has been for 13 years. I get up very early, we swim, with this, with that, I write a poem, and I spend the rest of the day listening to classical music and reading. I just read voraciously every day. What do I read? I read English, Spanish. I try to combine the two. B, I read everyday poetry. And in the last 2 years, I've noticed that the only thing that really satisfies me in terms of reading is reading poetry. I read in several languages. I read Portuguese. I speak Portuguese very well. I did my PhD in Luso-Brazilian literature. But I can read easily French, German, Italian, etc., as long as I have the translations. So I'll take Rilke and I'll work with it. There's a new translation of Rilke, for instance, by a Chilean translator, and it's magnificent. So I have the German text and I have the Spanish text, and I go line by line, just simply reading the text. And it's a delight. It's an absolute delight. I read constantly American poetry. So poetry is one thing. I enjoyed very much reading theory for a number of years. I mean, I was enthralled by Deleuze, by Derrida, by Bach, Barthes, all this. I find it a bore now. I cannot take it. I'm fed up with all that. When I see a diagram as an explanation of Madame Bovary, I don't want to, deal with that. I read a lot of novels. I'm reading now Sándor Márai, the Hungarian writer who's a big boom in Spain and especially in Argentina. I found his work 2 years ago. I was taken by him, and I'm the type of reader that if I fall in love with an author, I become voracious. I want to read everything by that author, but I mean everything. So I'm doing this now with Hungarian literature. And specifically with Sándor Márai. So normally, if you were in my house and you came into my room, you would see that there's a stack of books like this, which are the books I plan to read in the next few weeks. And next to me, you have about 4 or 5 books, usually laying in the bed. There's a chair, or una butaca, an armchair, which I call the armchair of the old man, where I sit for hours, and the only movement I do is this: take a new book, put the one I'm reading, and my whole life is, doing this, doing that, until she calls me and she says, lunch is ready, So I work. And
what are you reading right now?
what am I reading right
Yes,
now?
what are the books you're reading right now?
Okay, I'm reading Sándor Márai, the book he brought me from Argentina. I'm reading. I just finished a book of 10 Russian poets, among them Tarkovsky's father, or Mandelstam, whom I'm rereading. There's those 2. My memory is so bad. Because I'm here now and I'm not really reading, because when I travel it's hard to read. And I'm reading Pearson's book on Philip II, which is a marvelous book that was published by Fondo de Cultura. So I'm reading about Philip II. And I'm, again, extremely interested in essays dealing with the Spanish Golden Century, which nourishes me tremendously. I'm also rereading a new critical edition of Góngora's Soledades, which are one of the most difficult books on earth, they say. I mean, he's a pre-Joyce. He's as difficult to read as reading Finnegan's Wake or Ulysses. These Soledades were critically studied by a Marxist. And the minute I hear that word, I'm not interested. But in this case, I was highly recommended to read him because he is a very peculiar Marxist. To begin with, he's extremely open to non-Marxist versions of the Soledades. And his prologue, which is about 50 pages, is really magnificent. To the degree that he praises tremendously a fellow by the name of Robert James, who's French, who's written a lot about the Soledades, and who's his enemy. He's formally his enemy. And he praises James, whereas James constantly attacks him. He's that kind of a person. And it's just a joy to read the Soledades. So what I do is the lines are so difficult that what I do is I read a stanza and maybe spend 10 minutes rereading and rethinking this stanza. I mean, this is perhaps the 10th time I read this book, which is a poem in 2 parts. So, it's sort of like working with the material. So that you do see that basically the process implies 2 separate languages, English and Spanish, and different genders of reading. I never read a bestseller. I mean, I'm almost 70 years of age, so I'm at a point in life where I don't waste my time. So if somebody says to me, read Isabel Allende, I'll say, no, I don't waste my time. I read Cervantes, I don't read Isabel Allende, this kind of thing. There's a lot of mercantilism in literature today that, I'm not going to waste my time with it. Sometimes I say I'm being unfair because a priori I'm saying this is no good. How do you know if you don't read it? I know. No, we know instinctively, we know from hearsay that this is all money-making devices. I mean, for that purpose, I don't need books. I'd rather sell shoes or dirty socks, but not books. Books are sacred.
We've heard a little bit about your composition process over the last couple of days, and that's been wonderful and fascinating to hear. And I'm wondering if we could hear a little bit more about it in terms of your audience. At what point do you imagine your reader? And who is your first reader? Is it Guadalupe? And how do you negotiate that relationship? If she is your first reader, how does that work out for the...
It works wonderfully because I'm fortunate enough to... Lupe and I, we met because she read a book of mine. So first she fell in love with my literature and then with me. And the order hasn't changed.
Is that true?
There's a G20 in Pittsburgh, so no comment.
And ever since we met, we've been really a very isolated couple. When we travel, it's like this, and especially now that I'm kind of a known poet. But life hasn't been easy. There's been, as any other human being, tremendous difficulties. But we always were very solid as a couple since the very beginning. We tell friends that, and this is a true fact, that we have never had a fight in 35 years but a fight, and once in a while, because we disagree constantly. She's a very difficult woman. Whereas I'm so easygoing and angelical. Right? So once in a while, we're at the verge of fighting, and we look at each other and we say, it's a waste of time. Why fight? There's no need for it. So we sit down, we talk, and we discuss our issues. So since the very beginning, I began to show her my poems. And since the very beginning, funnily enough, she created a scale of values in her response that go from throw it in the garbage to it's godlike, So if she says to me, this is false or no good or phony or whatever, I really listen to her. And I go back to the poem and rethink things. If she gives me the okay, the nil obstat, this is it. I have no need for any further dialogue with the poem. So she is because she's very honest, at least with me and with my work. There is no... For instance, I gave a reading yesterday. When we got to the room, I looked at her and I said, how was it? And she said, I think you were marvelous. She said, okay. So, I really believe that what she's saying to me at that point is not catering, but what she really feels. So lately, something very funny happened in our life. She has a room where she works. She's into history. She is extraordinarily keen to history, daily life, politics, and I'm totally out of that, completely out of that. So once a day I go to him and I say, we sit down and I say, please tell me about the world. So she tells you Obama, this, that. I listen to that, that's it. And I have my room in which I read, I write, this and that. And when I finish correcting a poem, not always, say out of 7 poems in a week, maybe 3 or 4 I'll send to her. But I send it through the machine, to her machine. So I'm sitting here and I'm emailing her an attachment with my poem, in which I simply say, G, poem, J, J, that's it. So maybe in an hour and a half or 2 hours, I get a response that says, J, J, tremendous, marvelous. How do you manage doing this? Whatever, And lately, correct me if I'm wrong, everything I've sent her, she loves. So I'm in heaven. There hasn't been any poem lately that doesn't surprise her, so I'm doing very well. I'm doing very well. And she's been my sounding board for many, many years. Beyond that, one reason I feel that I'm doing okay as a poet is because there are a lot of well-known poets in Latin America that detest me, that envy me, that are unhappy that I exist, you know, and that's a good sign. That's a very good sign. And the other aspect of it is that I feel that I'm much loved by many people, especially the young poets in Latin America, not in Spain. With Spain I have conflicts, but in Latin America, wherever I go, I get, you know, a feedback of this nature, and this is very rewarding. I've worked all my life. I have a project, because I do have a project, like Mallarmé had a project. And my project is a monstrosity. I mean, a person that writes almost 8,000 poems in a lifetime of the nature of my poetry is a monster, and I am a monster. It's a monstrous project. But I'm very peaceful and tranquil about it. It's become very natural to live this way, to be this way, and there's basically it's no big deal for me. But the response is beginning to be, it's always a response of amazement, of, wow, how do you do this, blah, blah, you know. So now I'm reaping the fruits, I think. Not monetarily yet, but I'm reaping the fruits. When I say to people, and this happened right now in Argentina, I was talking to a Chilean poet, and he said, you know, you're becoming expensive, you're becoming difficult to get, you know, this and that. You're traveling all over. So I said, do you realize also that I have never received a poetry prize? And he jumped. They always jump when I say this. And he says, what do you mean? You must have all prizes. I said, I've never gotten a single poetry prize. So immediately they say, how come? And I said, I'm Cuban abroad, and being Cuban has been a nightmare. You don't know what it meant to be a Cuban in exile in the 1960s, where all the left-wing politics saw us as fascists, which of course we are not. We left Cuba for reasons that rejected a form of fascism that was disguised as revolution. This is not a revolution. No revolution can be done on the basis of tyranny. So, you know, this is number one. Number two, the nature of the beast. My poetry is extremely complex. You don't sit down with a poem in here, you read and you say, no. You may be intrigued. You know, I always said to my students, take a symphony by Beethoven. You listen to it once. You may say, I'm not interested. Fine, you're not interested. But if you are interested and you want to really move in the direction of Beethoven, you have to listen to that symphony 10, 100 times. Yes? So, you know, this is the same thing with a certain type of poetry. There are basically two forms of poetry, as there is Plato and Aristotle. There is linear poetry and Baroque poetry. There's nothing else. The English tradition is not into the Baroque. I mean, your Baroqueness is in the metaphysical poets. It's in John Donne, in George Herbert, in you know, Marvell, this type of poets. But this is not a nation, neither was Britain, of this type of poetry. In the States, the Baroque poets, the dense and difficult poets, are completely marginal to this day. To me, the person that comes after Emily Dickinson is Lorraine. I pronounce her Niederker, but I heard you say the other day Niederker.
Well, that's because Forrest always says Niederker. He always says it wrong. It is Niederker.
Okay, so she is as great as Miss Dickinson. However, Lorraine Niederker is highly difficult to read, even though she writes very little poems. But they're very mysterious and very complex to read. And you can do different readings of a little poem of Miss Niederker forever. If you take her, she's the easiest of the ones I'm going to mention now. Try and read Louis Zukowski, and you will find an experience of this nature. You read a Zukowski poem, and as you read, all the words are as transparent as reading a bestseller. And yet you don't get it. This happens to me. I reread the man, I love the man, I begin to feel comfortable with him, and there's something in there that always escapes me. It's in the Baroqueness of his mind. You see, for instance, he has a book of flowers. It's called 80 Flowers. It was the last stuff he wrote. Actually, there were 81 flowers, in which he simply, almost botanically describes, but yet poetically describes, a given flower, a common flower, a rose, a sunflower. Every poem has 5 lines. Every line has 5 words. The density of those poems, have you seen them? is unbelievable. I mean, it requires a devotion to read this material. The devotion leads, as far as I'm concerned, to fruitfulness. When I go through this and I finally see, I feel illuminated by the brilliance of what this man did. Take Charles Olson, who's a monstrous thing, you know. Is he read? No, he's not read. People are still doing doctoral dissertations on Robert Frost. I mean, I have nothing against Robert Frost, but it's a type of poetry that is much easier. I think if someone, a young person came to me and said, I want to read poetry, what do? I say, read first Mr. Robert Frost. I'm not going to say to the person, read Louis Zukowski. I'll lose him. But, you know, read Mr. Robert Frost so that eventually you can read Mr. Louis Zukowski, so that you can read all. I'm not rejecting anyone. I'm trying to, in a Catholic fashion, to include everyone into this space which is called poetry, which is a magical, obscure, complex, strange, and most beautiful space. If you enter into that realm, I assure you that your life is a wonderful life. It's as simple as that. I didn't answer your question.
Can I add something to that too? I think it's interesting. Poets of my generation in the United States are what we call a post-language poetry moment. Post-language, not language as language, but language as all caps, language, which is something that happened in the 70s and 80s and 90s in New York. I mean, during much of your career, an important moment in your career. And you mentioned your relationship to theory, and it was a poetry largely very counter to, I think, your notion of process and your notion of how a poem happens. It was very, systematized, engaging a lot of theory, finding practices to make poems, very sort of logical, intellectual, kind of worked, intentional poetry. And that's, I think, what it's criticized for. And recently, I read an article by a really great young poet, Joshua Corey, about how we are moving in our moment, in this crisis, how do we get past this into a Baroque style as a way to return, I think, to, a notion of how a poem happens that's very much like yours. And maybe a question would be, how did it feel, much of the avant-garde in the 70s and 80s and 90s was doing this, which is so different from your project. And you were among these people. I mean, they were largely in California, but they were in New York, and it was everywhere. Everybody had to sort of deal with this moment. How did you interact with the poetries in the United States?
I didn't.
Yeah.
I didn't because I was writing in Spanish, and that created a barrier. I never wrote in English, so basically I didn't. And I did my learning, I said it the other day in your class, I did my learning with painters rather than with poets. I detest poets. They're awful. They're vain. They're constantly fighting.
They?
You see? You see what I mean? 35 years of this. Huh? Do I need any form of purification? Look at it. And, so it went this way. But maybe I can take the opportunity to explain one thing. This type of work that I do and others do, especially in Latin America. Spain is more conversational now. But if you read the new poetry of Latin America, in all countries you'll find 20, 30 young people working different, but in this fashion. It has to do with the following. The Golden Century moved into the Baroque mood in the following manner. It went back because the Renaissance had rediscovered the Greco-Latin culture that had been totally devastated by the barbarian invasions, and that luckily the monasteries partially saved and conserved. So there's a boom. It was a boom after the discovery of America, where the Renaissance brings back all this material. By the time of Góngora and Quevedo and the Baroque poets, all this has been assimilated, and they begin to look into the traditional materials as something very stable that has become so conventional that you have to start dealing with it differently. And what they do is they mock, they make fun, they deconstruct all those materials. but always in terms of black and white, meaning Zeus is no longer a true god. The true god is the god of the Christians. So that we can now take that god, which is totally obsolete, and make fun of him. And Góngora and the Spanish writers can look at these materials and debunk everything, but always in terms of that and the writer. The poetry becomes difficult because the Inquisition is on top of everything. It's an eye, it's a huge eye, almost like Polyphemus, with this huge central eye, making sure that nothing of a non-orthodox manner gets published. There's tremendous censorship. So the more difficult you become, the more you can evade the censor. And that's why the poetry becomes so extraordinarily difficult. Cervantes' masterpiece, Don Quixote, who never mentions God, nor once, and if he mentions God, it's mentioned in trite phrases like Dios mío, this type of phrases, was only the Inquisition, the censorship, the Index Librorum only asked Cervantes to delete 3 lines. And yet in Don Quixote you have things like Sancho and Don Quixote at night are entering a small town. Don Quixote, or Sancho, I don't remember exactly, bangs against the church, a wall of a church, falls from the horse, and the comment that ensues is, you have banged yourself against the church, because it was a physical church, to which the other character, being Don Quixote or being Sancho, I don't remember, says, beware you don't end up in your sepultura, beware you don't end up in the cemetery, because the church at the time, the cemetery was next to the church. Now, how can the Inquisition accept this? Very simple. A madman, Don Quixote, and a fool, this little gordito, this little fat fool, are making the statements. So Cervantes found a very intelligent and complex manner of saying freely whatever he wanted to say. Cervantes was of Jewish origin, and this has been documented. He came from a Galician doctor who was a convert Jew, and so was Góngora. Do you know that 1/3 of the saints of the Catholic Church that come from Spain are of Jewish origin? Converts. They received an overdoses of Catholicism at home to hide from the persecution. In that context, poetry becomes extremely rarefied, extremely difficult, because it's the only way you can say what you need to say. Now, here we come. In Cuba, through Lezama Lima, through Severo Sarduy, in Brazil, through a fellow named Haroldo de Campos, who's a concretist poet, the movement is now not American poetry, which was very influential in the early stages of the 20th century, and which was extremely influential in the 50s, in the 60s, in Latin American poetry. Instead of that, we go back to the golden century, but with a difference.
What about into Rubén Darío and that type of...
Okay, there is, yes, and I'm glad that you remind me. There is the so-called modernismo, Rubén Darío, all the modernist Latin American poets that influenced Spain for the first time in the relationship between Spain and Latin America, and that bring to Spain a mode that is more dense and more Baroque, more musical, because it's based on French symbolism. They read Mallarmé, they read Verlaine, they read Rimbaud, so on and so forth. At this point, we come into the picture, and what we're doing is, because we're not being persecuted, there's no censorship saying to anyone, do not write this way or do not produce in this fashion. What we do is we begin to use poetry as a form of expressing the world in which we live. And the world in which we live is a difficult world. So that is why our poetry is a difficult poetry. Now it's not the issue of persecution, but as I look out, the referentialness that I'm exposed to is so tremendous that if I want to convey what I feel about this complexity, I have to convey it in a complex way. So that is why you have a Mr. James Joyce or a Miss Gertrude Stein writing this odd, this strange, this highly difficult to assimilate material. But Joyce said at one point, I'm leaving enough stuff in there for the critics to work for 1,000 years until they are able to clear for the reading public the references. In 50 years, everything has been cleared. So that, you know, when I hear somebody saying you're impossible to read, I simply reply by saying, read. You will see that I am not impossible to read. I did a long study, which I did in English, by the way, because it was for a university, of this whole thing, in which, thinking in terms of boxing, I described the Neobaroque as lightweight, middle weight, and heavyweight. And I established, in terms of all the Neobaroque poets that I know, that are my friends, you know, where do I fit them? For instance, among the heavyweight, there are very few. There's a certain Uruguayan poet that is very difficult to read. His name is Eduardo Espina. There's a certain Brazilian poet that is dead now, whose name is Leminski, who's extremely difficult to read. This fellow sitting here is extremely difficult to read, and he's extremely Neo-Baroque. And I'm not accusing, but I'm just. And then, for instance, there's a light Neo-Baroque where I can give you 20, 30 names that really you can sit, read, and maybe at a second reading you'll get it, that they're not impossible poets. And I find my work in between, because I'm very traditional. The problem with me is that I take something, whatever, an apple, and it begins to move in all sorts of directions. But there's an order. There is a directionless that is only apparent. If you go through it, you will see that it always comes together. It's like a cathedral, but it's more, not like a Gothic cathedral, but like a Gaudí cathedral. No? Yeah? That's what it is. I was with a Spanish critic once, years ago, and he was asking me questions of this nature. And he said, how would you explain to someone what you're doing? And we were entering Barcelona, and there was one of those things where you pay toll, and there were like 7 gates, I remember clearly because I counted them, to pay toll. And I said to him, you see, the non-Baroque poetry goes through a gate, period.
You said that you had trouble negotiating like the distinction between faith and belief, which really interested me. And then you said that poetry for you is like almost like a communion in a certain sense with God, with pure faith, and that also really interested me. Going through STEP, I noticed you have a real affinity for like strong visual imagery, like very in sensory stuff, especially in the one you wrote about your grandfather last night, Tracy being scribe. Excellent. And what I'm curious about is, do you find in like empirical, everyday sensory information, like just your senses, this kind of spirituality, because it's self-evident in its like beauty and its joy, and it's unlike like belief, which requires you to make a commitment beyond things that are evident to you. I'm just trying to draw from what I'm picking up in your poetry. It's all of this sensory information. Do you see I'm trying to phrase this in a formal question. do you think that you find spirituality in like everyday sensation?
You know, 2 things to your speech. One is, and this is into Zen Buddhism, my whole struggle is with, and it's in the poetry, it's always in the poetry, is trying to grab something that is permanent. The minute I grab it, it becomes ephemeral. So that when Cézanne looks at an apple, the apple should be integral. What happens to him? It becomes geometry, it becomes prismatic. It's exactly what happens to me. I see this and I try to grab. As I grab, it becomes deformed, monstrous. So I'm not really grabbing because it escapes me. This escaping of the material is what allows me to continue writing, because I haven't written the poem that would be the poem of poems. So that all the process of writing for me is, I don't write books, even though I've published 51, 52 books, who cares, you know. I'm writing a book, a book that contains all the poems that I have written and all the poems that I will write till I stop writing or till the day I die. So that the project is Malagmeyan. The project is on the basis of that book, which I don't want to call a book with a capital L, libro, because that sounds like, competing with the Bible, But it's a book that has a capital form in terms of my conception of the whole thing. So that this, I don't know if this is an English word, this is the inascibility that I cannot grab something, that's part of the issue. The other issue implied in your question is, I come from very religious people, but I also come from atheists. So since a child I was torn between visions, But it doesn't matter. If one is torn by visions, one ought to synthesize and solve the issue and come to terms with the difficulty. But poetry became, in my life, a center, a very important center. It's not the only one, but it's a very important center. So that what happened is that to this day, poetry became a substitution for religion. I don't need religion because I have poetry. I don't need to formalize belief because I believe in poetry. In the Celestina, which is a book of love, there's a moment where the main character, whose name is Callisto, is asked, "Do you believe in God?" And this is a book written by apparently a Jew. The author is not clear in terms of who wrote La Celestina, although it is kind of accepted that it's a certain fellow by the name of Fernando de Rojas, who was of Jewish origin. And when Callisto is asked, "Do you believe in God?" his girl, his Juliet, his name was Melibea. He says, "I believe in Melibea. Melibeo soy. I am a Melibean," and so on and so forth. Well, I can say the same thing in terms of poetry. If you said to me, "Do you believe in God?" my answer would be, "I believe in poetry. I am," so on and so forth. And it's an interference with the highest. And I struggle with this to this day. And I say to myself, if I would stop writing, and I've said this many times to Guadalupe, perhaps I would go into a Zen Buddhist monastery in Kyoto, which is one of my biggest fantasies, and spend the rest of my life there. And I think I would be extremely happy doing that if I stop writing. Yet I haven't stopped writing, and I don't think I'll stop writing, quite frankly. So that maybe I don't stop writing not to go to that monastery and fail. I don't know. But there is a process of replacement. Poetry has replaced other forms of search. If you are a young man looking for God, you have a search which has roads. My road became very clear, luckily, fortunately, when I was very young. And I've taken that road without any further ado, without any further problem. But it's a bit below the highest of aspirations, if I may say so. Yeah.
Well, if I may add on to that real quick, you said you had a lot of experiences in Buddhism, and when you were talking about the inaccessibility of an object and how as soon as you try to grasp it, it slips from your fingers. That's fascinating because it's so in the Buddhist mode of thought where you can't cross the same river twice, you can't cross the same river once because it's always changing and the Brahmi is becoming, everything's becoming itself. So if I may ask real quickly, do you find that in your poetry you have to deal with the Western notion of Western philosophy, like Plato, you mentioned, the static nature of Western philosophy, how things can be defined and nailed down, and your experience with Zen Buddhism, in which things are always changing, and there's a kind of spirituality in the very philosophy itself? Because now that you mentioned it, I think about the poems that I've read of yours, and there's always a process of trying to define the things that can't be defined, which is...
Well, what I appreciate about the Buddhist Zen mood is A, its inner freedom, which is tremendous. B, the sense of the present. The sense of the present. It is the present. In a present in which you and I and this microphone are Buddha, let's say. We're all Buddhas. I translated into Spanish the Sutra of the Heart Sutra, and I say it to myself 2-3 times a day, and it's wonderful. It's just wonderful. It's a constant learning in terms of dealing with the void and dealing with dissolution of just disappearance, which is nirvana. And Zen Buddhism has also been for me, if you are a Catholic, I think you'll understand very well what I'm going to say now. Our Occidental religions are very harsh. In spite of the softness of a Virgin Mary or Mariology, these are harsh religions. I mean, the Jewish religion is terrifying at many levels. When there is a God that claims for vengeance, I'm terrified. When they talk to you about heaven, but also hell. Hell, I don't believe exists. If there's something, it will be heaven, but no hell, you know. But it's terrifying. There's a harshness to that religion. This harshness I experienced as a child coming from my father. My father had that harshness, and yet he was an atheist, a true atheist, till the day he died. But the softness and tenderness came from the mother, and she was very soft, very tender, more Christ-like than Jewish, although she didn't know that, and if she heard me say that, she'd spank me. And I found myself caught in that harshness, which I couldn't really comprehend, because there were figures in my family, the grandfather, for instance, that they were so benevolent. So how can I put together the benevolence of my grandfather and a Bible that is telling me ojo por ojo, diente por diente, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a soul for a soul, which is terrifying, alma por alma. I mean, this is a terrifying statement. How do you put these things together? When I was in my 30s in New York, I came to New York when I was 20, I began reading Oriental literature. One of my first experiences was with Chinese and Japanese poetry, which came through Kenneth Rexroth and his translations from the Chinese and the Japanese, and it opened up a new world. That new world was countering the Occidental aspect of my life. And I began seeking a synthesis between the two, so that the Buddhism softened the harshness of my Judaism, and my Judaism, which is stern, added a sternness to my need to be lazy and soft and just the present and all that. And, you know, I think the poetry is catching this. I dare say things in poems. I mean, this is a large opus. You can imagine what's in here. But I've shown Guadalupe certain things, and she says to me, yeah, how can you say a thing like this? And my answer is, I'm not responsible. I'm not responsible. This is being dictated, that's all. Leave me alone, you know. But I say terrible things. I fight with God like you know, like Isaac was fighting with the angels, you know, in the scale of Jacob, I mean, you know, when he becomes Israel. So, you know. Okay. I have to go to your class, right?
Yeah, I think
11th. Okay. So I can rest a little bit from then? Yeah?
Thank you so much for coming. That was extraordinary, Jose.
Thank you very much.
I want you to know that I'm very happy to be here. I feel at home with the place, with you people, yesterday, the room, the treatment. I'm very grateful to you, and I mean this. I really mean it.